Welcome back and thank you for joining us. This PowerPoint presentation and the accompanying narration was designed for East Texas Baptist University for use in the course Criminal Justice 3314 Criminal Investigation. And I'm Dr. Eric Hillman. The textbook that we use in this course is entitled Criminal Investigation, 11th edition by Hess, Orthman, and Cho. The student's viewing of this presentation is designed to supplement the reading of the textbook and not simply to replace it. Chapter 10 is entitled Sex Offenses. Chapter 10 has been divided into shorter segments for easier online viewing. This is Chapter 10B. When we talk about human trafficking, we talk also in terms of slavery. Now, the main form of slavery we recognize in the United States was the slavery of black people who were, their ancestors were originally forcibly taken from Africa and brought mostly to Brazil, but also to Cuba and the United States. The 13th Amendment in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, abolished slavery in the United States. But modern-day slavery still exists. And it exists in the form of human trafficking. That is defined as recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. The key idea of human trafficking is exploitation of people, and in this case it's mostly women, and not movement. So when you see the word trafficking, you might be tempted to think, okay, a person has to be moved from one location to the other. Not necessarily. If they're exploited in a sexual manner, that could be human trafficking. The Mann Act was put into place in 1910. The Mann Act was also called the White Slave Traffic Act. Basically, what the Mann Act did was make it illegal to transport women across state lines for prostitution or immoral purposes. And of course, we understand the evil of prostitution, but the morality of the society was different in 1910. So transporting someone across state lines for immoral purposes could include an unmarried couple traveling from, say, Houston, Texas to New Orleans and then engaging in sexual activity outside of marriage. So that would be considered illegal, and it would be across a state line. So a person could be prosecuted under the Mann Act of 1910 just for crossing state lines with your girlfriend and then engaging in sexual activity outside of marriage. Human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it affects about 20 million people per year. So it has a global reach in almost every country. There's three categories of human trafficking. The first one is for labor. Now, this is there are slightly more female victims than male in labor. So the female victims may be forced to work as servants in a home, for instance. Male labor, human trafficking, may be forced to work in fields, harvesting crops. But the idea is, of course, that they're exploited, they're forced to do it against their will. Sex trafficking involves, of course, mostly female, 98% female, because most of the customers are male. However, there are some male victims for those seeking to exploit mostly young males in a homosexual relationship. And the third category would be organs. If some rich person needs an organ, it's possible that someone could be kidnapped and have their organ taken, maybe drug them and remove one kidney and leave the other, etc. This is not very common, but it's based on blood type rather than gender. What are human trafficking venues? Well, there are commercial front brothels one of the most common in the Houston area where I used to be a police officer was massage parlors. And massage parlors really across the country have historically been associated with prostitution. Now, there is a legitimate industry of massage therapists. They often work with chiropractors and work on health issues, but not everyone who says they're employed in massage is an upright person. Internet ads, of course, have become one of the dominant venues now that wasn't there 30, 40, 50 years ago. Hotels and motels, especially if they're in areas where truck drivers frequent. Truck drivers may be single, or they may be married, but only get home once every 2 weeks, and they're looking for some company. And so a lot of the prostitutes know which hotels are good places to sell their services. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000, also known as the TVPA. And it employs a 3P paradigm. What are those 3 Ps? Prosecution of traffickers, protection of victims, and prevention of crime. So those are the goals of the TVPA. And they also use a 4th P. They accomplish that 3P paradigm by a partnership in task forces. What that means is several different agencies have gotten together to fight human trafficking. Now, what is the difference between trafficking and smuggling? Well, smuggling means paying to be brought across the border, and that's pretty common. In Texas, of course, the predominant smuggling we see is of Mexican citizens or people from El Salvador or Guatemala and Central America being brought through Mexico by coyotes. And coyotes are simply people who, that's what they do for a living. They accept money to bring people and sneak them across the border. If you come from Central America, you may have to sneak across 2 borders. First, the border into Mexico, and then the border out of Mexico into the United States. Trafficking, on the other hand, is a person being forced to work or held against their will, often after the smuggling has been completed. Therefore, a person can voluntarily pay for smuggling. In that case, they wouldn't be considered a victim of human trafficking unless the people trafficking them already have an illicit plan for them. They haven't been told. But even though they voluntarily pay to get smuggled into the United States, once they're here, they can then involuntarily be forced into, for instance, sex trafficking. So there can be a voluntary stage and an involuntary stage. If we look at the victim's gender and the suspect's gender, we find in sex trafficking 94% are female and 6% male. Now that's in a 2008 to 2010 U.S. study. As you recall, one of the previous studies said 98% female, so that's going to vary across studies. The suspect's gender, of course, is predominantly male, 82% male. However, some sex trafficking is accomplished by females, and either by themselves or working with males. Sometimes a male sex trafficker will use a female accomplice because a victim may be more trusting of the female than of the male. If you look at the victim's age, most victims are less than 17, with a few being 18 to 24. But once you get over 24 years old, the number of sex trafficking victims drops off. Some of them die from drug overdoses, some of them escape, and some of them just realize, hey, I don't have to be a sex slave. The suspects' age are mostly 18 to 34. So the suspects tend to be young, but older than the female victims. And in most cases, wiser to the ways of the world and able to manipulate these young girls, 14, 15, 16-year-old girls. What about race? If you look at victims, we find that most sex trafficking victims are black, but there's also a very significant number of white and Hispanic sex trafficking victims. Now that's in the United States, and the reason Asian is so low is because it costs a lot of money for the traffickers to bring victims over from Asia. If you looked at the Asian sex trafficking market, of course it would be predominantly Asian in areas like Thailand, etc. What about the suspects? The suspects we find are predominantly black. Hispanic, second biggest group, and then white comes in only at 6%. So in U.S. sex trafficking, the suspects are mostly black and the victims are mostly black. Traffickers use different types of tactics, but police have identified general themes. They look for poor and vulnerable people searching for a better life. You go to Central America, you go to Mexico, and you find some very poor people and just tell them, hey, I can get you into the United States, and when you get there, you can make lots of money. And that sounds pretty good to someone who's dirt poor. I'll give you a good job there, you'll have a stable life, you can send back money to your parents and grandparents. Oh, by the way, there's some really good-looking girls there in the United States, and they really like Hispanic guys. Basically promise whatever they think they want to hear. Then, when they're brought over, they can be forced to work with little or no pay. Well, why wouldn't someone just run away if they were working as a labor slave in the United States? Well, because even as a labor slave, they may be making more money than they make in Mexico. They're afraid to report their exploitation to the police for fear that once the police get involved, they'll simply be deported back to Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, etc. And the traffickers still work on their minds and say, well, yeah, it's going to be like this for a while because we got to make the money back that we spent getting you over here. But once we earn that money back, then you can start putting all your own money in your own pocket. But for now, I have to take it until you pay your way. Where are they forced to work? In agriculture, harvesting fruits and vegetables in the field. In factories, sometimes working 12, 14, 16-hour days. In strip clubs for females. In prostitution. Working as domestic servants, in some cases treated very poorly for little or no money. And the traffickers use both physical and psychological abuse to maintain control. Physical is easy to explain. He beats her up if she doesn't do what he says. Psychological abuse can be a little bit more complicated. They're going to use fear. Fear is a very compelling motivation. If you don't do what I say, I'm here to protect you. And you know, by the way, you're a prostitute now, you're a criminal, and you're going to be arrested by the police if you go to the police with anything. If you do go to the police, I'm going to kill you. You can't hide forever. I've got friends all over this city. We'll find you and we will kill you. Not only that, but we know where you live. We know that you've got a young daughter and a young son, a 2-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son, and we're going to kill them too. You know, and by the way, you're just a whore. You can't go back to your family in Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala. You know, you have they're poor, but they have good morals. You know, you're going to go back there now that, and you think they're going to accept you back in their home now that you're a whore? You're worthless. Besides, I pay for this apartment for you. I pay for your food. I pay for your clothes. Everything you have, I give to you. You leave me, you got nothing. Drug traffickers and sex traffickers often promote drug dependency. So the young girl is hooked on heroin, on crack, on sometimes meth, whatever it takes, and then because the sex trafficker has such strict control over her, he becomes the only source of the drugs, to the point where she is begging him for drugs. And she's willing to do anything to get that next fix. That's where he wants her, willing to do anything. There are some red flags that you can look for in human trafficking, many of which, if you are observant, you will see as a police officer driving around in your beat. First of all, when there's factories, of course the buildings need security because they don't want equipment stolen. But as you look at these buildings, is that security intended to keep people out, or is it intended to keep people in? If this is an active factory, why are those windows boarded up? Are they trying to keep people from looking in? Are workers required to live on site? Now, normally with these labor trafficking enterprises and factories, they will try to keep the police out, but on occasion the police will come in, and they of course have prepared for that eventuality by telling all these workers that the police are your enemy, the police, you are here illegally, the police will arrest you, put you in jail, put you in prison, call immigration, you lose everything you've worked for, etc. So these workers will often not cooperate with you, and so you are left to read some of these red flags by yourself. Are the workers required to live on site? If you've got 50 workers in the building and only 4 cars outside, what does that tell you? Are there living quarters there, like small apartments or dorm rooms? Are these workers not free to come and go as they will? Are they required to work excessive hours or unusual hours instead of a normal 8-hour day? All of us are required to work overtime sometimes to 8 or 12 hours. I've had to work 16-hour days on just a handful of occasions. But if they're working 16-hour days regularly, what does that say? Sometimes laborers are kept on location saying, by the employers saying to them, you know, I spent $10,000 to get you here from Mexico or from Bangladesh or from wherever, and until you pay that debt off, you can't leave. But then the debt keeps accumulating. They pay a little bit off, but then they seem to owe more for food and clothes, etc. And it's a never-ending battle to pay off this debt. Are there signs of malnourishment, not enough to eat, or fatigue, not enough sleep? Is health care available? Are they forbidden to have any communications with the outside world? Now, a lot of companies will forbid you to have a cell phone while at work, but when you arrive at work, you simply put it in your locker or something like that. But if they are forbidden to have cell phones at all, maybe that's a sign of human trafficking. Are they allowed to retain their own identification papers, IDs, immigration documents, money, or does the employer take over all those things from the employees or the victims? They look like they have enough personal possessions for a person, or do they simply have 2 shirts, 2 pants, 2 socks, 2 underwear, and that's all they have to their name? They understand what day, what month, what year it is. One thing you can do is simply ask them what their address is. If they don't even know their address, or on occasion don't even know what city they're in, that certainly is a very strong indicator of trafficking. Now, the U.S. government has come up with something called a T visa, for trafficking visa. Now, we understand that a lot of the victims of human trafficking are in the U.S. illegally, so they are afraid to go to the police. They're afraid to cooperate with the police. In many cases, they don't understand the difference between police and immigration. And certainly if they're sex traffickers, they've also been told that they are criminals and the police are going to arrest them, throw them in jail, throw them in prison. So the U.S. government created something called the T visa that gives human trafficking victims a temporary visa to remain in the United States for up to 4 years, but only if they cooperate with the prosecution of human traffickers. So if a victim is willing to testify against the trafficker, then that victim can be allowed to stay in the United States for up to 4 years. And they soon realized that they would still have lack of cooperation if their children, brothers, sisters, cousins, mom and dad were deported. And so family members also can receive protection under this program, and that encourages human trafficking victims to testify against the traffickers without fear of deportation. When the person has the T visa for up to 4 years, they can then be given some legal help to apply for permanent resident status, which is what we call the green card, and eventually possibly could apply for U.S. citizenship. There is a nationwide hotline called the National Human Trafficking Hotline that's available for victims of trafficking to call. And it's not just English and Spanish. There's actually more than 200 languages available on this hotline, because the assumption is victims can be trafficked from almost any part of the world into the United States. There's also something called ACT teams, anti-trafficking coordination teams, where several agencies, federal agencies, have gotten together, specifically the State Department, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Labor have joined forces to collaborate to fight human trafficking. So when you have contact with trafficking victims as a police officer, you've got to remember that the traffickers or captors can force their victims to commit crime. Does she really want to be a prostitute, or is she being forced into it? Does she really want to use or do drugs, or has she been forced to sell the drugs? Has she been made into an addict? Does she really want to be a thief, or is she being told by her captor that you have to do this? And so if you look at the picture on the bottom left, how old is that girl? I don't know, 11 or 12? If someone raped her, she would be a rape victim. And if you see her as an innocent little girl, we would certainly be sympathetic to her and we want to prosecute the man who raped her. On the other hand, what if that same man who rapes her then turns her into a prostitute and she's forced to be a prostitute? Well, suddenly she's a criminal and she could be arrested for prostitution. And so what are we going to call her? Are we going to call her a victim or a criminal? I guess what I'm saying is sometimes if you have eyes to see and a heart to feel what's happening here, you can understand there may be more to it than just this girl selling herself and therefore she's a prostitute and a criminal. If you treat people like criminals, what happens? They realize they can't trust the police, they don't need to do anything, have anything to do with the police, and they certainly don't need to cooperate with the police. And suddenly you push them closer to the traffickers. If you arrest them, they're looking at jail time. The trafficker comes and bails her out of jail. The trafficker says, I'm your friend, the police are your enemy. I'm going to take good care of you. And suddenly the trafficker becomes the hero and the police officer the enemy, and that's what we don't want. So when you talk to someone, especially young girls who may be a prostitute, you have to understand she may be forced into it. So you need to show compassion even though she's technically a criminal. And it's good to be non-judgmental. You don't know what she has gone through that made her arrive at this point. So show her the love of Christ. Eventually you'll have to ask about immigration questions, but don't start too early, because if your first question is on their immigration status, they're going to be afraid of you. No, I don't want to be deported back to El Salvador. And they won't cooperate with you, or maybe even lie to protect the pimp. And avoid trigger questions. Things like, well, are you a sex slave? Well, people, even if they are a sex slave, don't want to think of themselves as a sex slave. So sometimes you establish the rapport and the trust first, and then you ask the questions in a non-judgmental, compassionate way, and avoid using trigger questions. Now, how many sexual assault or rape victims are there in the United States? Well, the FBI has something called the UCR, Uniform Crime Reports, to count sexual assaults, but the FBI only counts sexual assaults that are reported to the police. And up until 2013, they only counted female victims and only by force. Now, as you recall, that was the issue in the old definition of rape rather than the new definition of sexual assault. But we know that sexual assault victims can be male, and we know that, for instance, if the person is drugged, they could be raped without the use of force. So probably a more accurate representation of the amount of sexual assault in the country is done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. That's part of the Department of Justice. They have something called the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey. And they include both reported to the police rapes and unreported events. And so this is a survey of crime victims. And what they find is only about 1/3 of rapes are reported. Approximately 2/3 of rapes are never even reported to the police. The Center for Disease Control did a study and found that 18% of women are raped sometime in their life. That's a very high percentage. That's almost 1 out of every 5 women is raped in their lifetime. Also, 1% of men say that they were raped in their lifetime. That could be in a homosexual setting, but it also could be in a prison setting. In 2013, the FBI said there were 79,000 rapes reported to the police. But the NCVS, which did a more informal survey of rape victims, found that there were over 300,000 rapes, and many of those were repeat victims. So the actual picture of sexual assault in the United States is much higher than what is reported to the police. So why wouldn't someone report a rape? That's a serious crime. Why not report it? Well, she may not be sure what rape is. If she says, yeah, I invited him to my apartment, but we were just going to sit and watch a movie and hold hands. Well, you know, when I held hands with him and we're lying on the couch, you know, does that mean that that was an invitation that he could do what he wanted? What if I do call the police, maybe he'll take revenge or retaliate against me? Oh, it was my fault. I shouldn't have been drinking. I shouldn't have been wearing those clothes. Well, yes, maybe you shouldn't have been drinking. Maybe you shouldn't have been wearing those clothes. But he has a moral and legal duty to stop if she says no. If she says no and he doesn't stop, it's a sexual assault. She doesn't want to relive the event. This may be one of the most traumatic events of her life, and she wants to just forget about it. She doesn't want to have to relive it by telling it to the police and possibly relive it again by telling it in court. If she knows the offender, maybe is this some guy she goes to school with, goes to class with, she doesn't want him to get in trouble, even though she doesn't really like him. Well, you know, I don't want all kinds of trouble for him. She's embarrassed. If I tell people I was raped, they'll say, you must have asked for it. There's stigma and blame to being a rape victim or sexual assault victim. Maybe your friends won't believe you. Maybe your friends will say, well, you must have come on to him. Especially if it's someone you know. And by the way, most rapes and sexual assaults are by someone the victim knows, not by a stranger. Then you're going to have friends in common. And some of those friends may side with the rapist when he says, no, she came on to me. She offered herself to me. I just took advantage of what she offered. And so she's afraid of friends not believing her, or friends calling her a slut. She doesn't know if she's going to be believed. She's afraid of the criminal justice system. She doesn't know what to expect. She doesn't know if her name and picture are going to be in the front page of the paper as being a rape victim. And even though she said no to this guy, her family doesn't know, her friends don't know, her parents don't know, but she's had a relationship with this other boyfriend, and she's afraid, well, nobody knows about that. It's just me and my boyfriend. We've never told anybody about our relationship. But now, I'm going to have to testify as to my sexual history. And I just don't want to do that, she says to herself. I don't want everyone knowing my history. And so these are all reasons why a woman may be afraid to report to the police that she has been sexually assaulted. How frequent is rape in your state? The darker the color on the screen, the more rapes there are. Alaska actually has the highest reported rate of rape. Now, not highest total number, but highest rate. That's per 100,000 people. So the darker the color of the state here, the higher the rate of rape. So Alaska, South Dakota are the highest. Looks like Michigan, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Arkansas are also pretty high. Texas is right in the middle. And interestingly, a lower rate in Vermont, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, and California. I'm not sure why that is, and why also. If someone is being raped, should they resist? If you resist, will that cause the rapist to run away or cause the rapist to be more violent? Well, we don't know. Now here, a woman was being raped, she resisted, and she was shot dead. Now, that's not in the United States. But if that was a gang rape, they're drunk, who knows what happened, I don't know all the details, but here she resisted and she was shot and killed. If there's lots of people around that could be aware of a woman screaming, it may be better to scream and he will run away rather than be discovered. He hopes that she'll remain quiet so he can do what he's going to do. Like in the back bedroom of a house where there's a party going on, and there's 30 people at the party. Well, if she screams, he's going to be found out, so he hopes she doesn't scream. On the other hand, if they're out in the woods on middle of the state forest on a camping trip and she's just walking along all by herself and he is going to rape her, maybe no one will hear her scream out in 1,000-acre state or national forest. So the studies are mixed on whether she should resist or not. Ultimately, it's going to be an individual decision. I don't want to tell someone to resist and then have them get killed over it. On the other hand, sometimes no resistance at all will lead to a rape where some resistance would have foiled it. And that's the end of Chapter 10B. Once you watch this and take notes, I encourage you to continue on to Chapter 10C. Thanks and have a great day.